The information shared on this podcast is based on our comprehensive research and understanding. All suspects are presumed innocent until proven guilty. Listener discretion is advised.
Hey y'all, welcome back to A Natural State of Murder. I'm Jess and I'm here with Jeremy and Patty. Do not forget to like and subscribe on YouTube and do not forget to follow us on iTunes, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcast. Also, do not forget to go and visit our website, remembereveryvictim.com. Our last episode, we left off with Alvin Lee Myers and his manifesto. And in the first part of that manifesto, he really talked about these abilities that he has. Um, and where we left off, the tone of that manifesto kind of changed. And he started talking a lot about crimes that he had committed over the years and like his first time that he went to prison. Patty, do you want to share some of those crimes that he does discuss in his manifesto?
Well, there is something I want to say before I even start about that. You had mentioned that he talks about going to see this woman and her two children in Pennsylvania. And this was an earlier part, I think, of the manifesto. And so you kind of piqued my interest when you started talking about Pennsylvania. I did reach out to the cold case team in Pennsylvania. I talked to a detective there, and they didn't really show any interest. But then he talked about
Y-
Ohio too, and there's a lot of cold cases in Ohio.
Yes, and what he had, I think that kind of comes up when he talks about, and I thought he talked about it like in the latter part of his manifesto. He talks about his first partner in crime. Um, his name was Herman Edward Lamb, and they traveled around a lot together. And Lamb has his own backstory. Um, but they traveled together.
Herman Edward Lamb was convicted of killing a girl. Well, Herman Edward Lamb was convicted of killing a girl in Illinois, and he was also linked to a murder in Florida. But he also was tried for his ex-wife's murder and the four children, one of them which was a biological child of Herman Edward Lamb. It ended up in a hung jury or a mistrial. I think it was a mistrial. Maybe they found him not guilty. But I talked to a reporter that rode the elevator with him after, and he said he was just so condescending and arrogant about the whole thing. But Linda Wheeler, who was his ex-wife, she turned up. They found her body and the remains of her four children in Sequoia County, Oklahoma. And after her death, before they found her body, he turned her car in for the reward, or it was a repo. He got the commission for that. He also wrote some checks on her checkbook, and I think he may have even had some of her jewelry in Texas. Um, but he was not found guilty on that charge. So it's believed that Herman Edward Lamb, which grew up with Alvin up on Brushy Mountain, it's believed that he may have killed several women across the United States. He did like to travel a lot. He was a truck driver, and he did like to travel. And Alvin thought a lot of Herman Edward Lamb, along with Pretty Boy Floyd. They all grew up together on the same, or grew up on the same mountain.
And yeah, and they both did like to travel. And then Herman Lamb, he was eventually caught. I believe it was in Illinois, but he didn't. It was in 1977, and during that same time period, as he's traveling, um, Alvin uh, had mentioned Ohio, and that's also the same year he mentioned Pennsylvania, that he had joined like this Lonely Hearts Club, um, like pen pal program, and that he had traveled to Pennsylvania to meet with this woman and her two young children. And I know that you said that you have reached out to Pennsylvania and there really wasn't any interest in their cold case, but Ohio had several. And Jeremy, I mean, you're law enforcement, and you've worked cases like that. I mean, how do you like what are y'all looking for? Like if we have information we have and we want to share it for you, like law enforcement side, investigative side.
So we're going back. We're going back to 40 something years ago, or even 50 years ago. You got to think this is pre-internet. This is pre-cell phones. This is pre social media. Um, how did these people meet, know each other, and interact? Okay, so we've connected that they grew up in the same area. We've been able to connect that. We've connected that you know they were both into hurting people, obviously. And when you're looking at that, you're looking at back then getting away with a crime meant just doing one in the county over where nobody knew your name. There's a saying I hear all the time. It's called if you're looking for a genius, just look for somebody 2 miles down the road. And that's what you had a situation where people would go to another county, another state, just a little ways over, and commit a crime, and there was no communication between law enforcement at the time. We still have that problem today, even with all the technology and all the things we have, VICAP and all the internet and all the databases and things. We still have problems today trying to connect. How does this person connect to these crimes, and how does these crimes connect to this person? You know, we turn it a lot of times into conspiracies. It's, oh, it must be cartel, it must be mafia. A lot of times it's just people that happen to know each other because they're both happen to be poor, piss poor people. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. The thing is, with you get two guys like that, the terrible twosome, and they want to go out and commit crimes. Doesn't take much at this point in time, especially at this point in time, to be a little bit smarter. There's no forensics, there's no DNA, none of that stuff existed. So how do you track them down? Well, they have to screw up. That's the truth. And the sad part about it is most crimes are solved because some criminal screwed up. If you really think about it, when you look at how law enforcement's able to solve cases like this, it's because they found a piece of evidence, they found a witness, they found a victim that was able to talk. They forgot to cover their tracks in some way. These two just got smarter than the system at that time, and they evolved with the system. Now, Edward eventually got caught. The thing about Alvin, and
You
the
know
thing
how
that intrigues
Edward
me about Alvin,
you know how Edward got caught? You know who the sister of the victim, she stayed on that for a
mm-hmm.
long time, and she's the one that connected him to her sister and to the one in Florida.
Mhm. And it was more than 30 years later. I mean,
Mm. It was a long time later,
that was in
yeah.
77. It was well after 2000. I mean, years had gone by, but I guess my question is when did it become a thing that like you have these cold cases, but back when these murders happened, at what point in time did they start collecting, I don't know, like DNA evidence, whether it, be blood or hair samples, or they had to have known it was going to be a thing.
80s, early 90s, when that started becoming a thing. Back then, even back to Jack the Ripper, fingerprints have been around for a long time. Fingerprints are not something new. Um, what's sad is that technology is so old that a lot of departments don't even use it anymore. I mean, it's you still have criminals that use gloves to go commit crimes when we don't. Most of the time, don't even look for that. We're looking for trace DNA. Every time you walk into a room and walk out now, you're leaving your DNA in that room. We have the ability now to prove you were in that room within a time period if things haven't changed. So in order to solve those crimes back then, you needed a witness, You needed a fingerprint, or you needed a victim that was willing to come forward. And that's what finally happened later on is you had somebody who witnessed and knew enough about the situation to come forward. It's really really tough, and so the technology is advanced, but we have to be able to apply that new technology to an old case and pray that the people that are responsible for the crimes are still alive. That's what cold case is. That's what cold case is. It's a whole lot of wading through the BS, listening to the stories. Patty and I have heard 43 stories this week of on other cases that we're working that we sit there and we go, there's no way this is true. And, well, is it true? And you have to wade through that. And there's no, it's not a perfect science. It's instinct, it's experience, it's knowledge, and you eventually figure out that okay, what makes sense is usually the most common thing usually comes out to be the truth. That's what's intriguing about all these cases, though, because it's not common to have people that just like to go around killing people. It's just not. That's not a real common thing. If it was, our society would be much more at risk. So unknown subjects of a murder are not common. That's not something that happens. It's much more common for someone gets killed, we know who did it. That is much more common. So you just don't get a lot of training for law enforcement and coroners and prosecutors for that type of how do I prove this? And then our standard of we have to prove in court is so high and it gets higher every year because some case law comes out that says, well, yeah, you obtained that, but you obtained it wrongfully. You obtained that, and you the victim's rights are never going to outweigh the suspect's rights. They're just not. That's not how our Constitution is written. That's not how our laws are written. That's not the way we're based. That's not our justice system. And I understand it. I'm not dogging it. I'm just saying that that's the way things are. So it's the burden of law enforcement to prove it. And we have to prove it through whatever means we can. And our hands are tied in a lot of ways. So, that's why I love Revamp because Revamp is able to do some things that and law enforcement can't. People will talk to uh, another victim advocate or a citizen that comes up and wants to talk. A lot of times they'll talk way more than they will to a law enforcement official that comes up and says, okay, I got to read you your rights. I got to go over this. And I have rules and regs and policies and procedures that I have to go by before I can ask you any questions. Patty's amazing at being able to walk into a room and just talk to anybody in that room and get information. Now, you have to cut through that information and realize how much of it. I had an old saying, I used to say the 5% rule. About 5% of what I'm told, I believe. Maybe it's higher than that, but that's what I just try to go by. I try to gauge it by take about 5% and go, okay, that's true. With Alvin's cases, that's what I don't know. When you read this manifesto and we're trying to recreate, did these crimes occur? What we find out more and more and more is they did. What we find out more and more and more is this guy was a legit bad guy. He legit did a lot of these crimes. And he also infiltrated himself into the investigations.
Jeremy's right, but also added to that is that in 1977 they didn't preserve the evidence looking towards DNA because they didn't know about DNA. So what they preserved and what they collected is not the same things they would collect now because they had no idea about the DNA. So a lot of times that may have been overlooked or it may have been destroyed once they got the blood type or whatever the case may be. But since technology has changed so much, I think the collection and what is collected has also changed. And you only have so much to work with, you know?
Yeah. I was just curious if it were possible if and this goes for, anybody that's been highly suspected, like Alvin or even Herman Lamb, um, running their DNA through a database of, I don't even know if that's a thing if they put DNA out for these cold cases, and trying to match it.
Jess, I think that we do. I think that you're talking about cases that are so old that there wouldn't be a way to match it anymore because there's no evidence still even around. That said, you've got a 99-year rule on most homicides. Most departments keep evidence for 99 years on any homicides now, but that didn't start in the 80s or the 70s. That's going to be more like starting in the, well, maybe late 80s. And and we do. I mean, you have to go to each individual department and you have to say, okay, go to every case you ever had. Most of these younger officers don't even know the cases they have in their vaults, in their evidence rooms. They have no idea. And you have to say, okay, go in there and take a look at the cases you have, and let's look at what you do have in there. You got an old cigarette butt from, 83. I mean, I solved a case from a cigarette butt from 83. Nobody even knew we had it. And of course, it was another agency that actually had it, not even our agency that had it, but where the vehicle was located. And those are the things that you have to go to, and that's what we're trying to do with the Cold Case Coalition, with Revamp, with all the things we're trying to build and get going in the right direction. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to go to these departments and say, hey, you may not even know you have this, but you might have this. And you have to understand turnover, aging out. Law enforcement's been through a rough decade. Since 9/11, law enforcement's totally a different world. We went into the terrorism world for a while, and that was what we were focused on. Meth labs, drugs, the drug war, all those things became the focus and where all the attention was based, where all the money was based. Cold cases were not, because it went by wayside due to the fact that you only have so much manpower, you only have so many things you can allocate towards your resources towards. Cold cases are tough to justify because you might solve 1 out of 1,000, and you have current cases that are constantly calling you, going, "Why haven't you done something?" So it takes an entity like Revamp, or it takes someone with passion for cold cases in that department to say, "Hey, I really want to look into this." So there's a lot of public interest in it. The cold case shows. I mean, you can't turn on a television show without seeing something cold case. But public interest and solvability factors are two different things. And the solvability factors, it has to go into a law enforcement's resources being allocated. They have to look at it and go, what is the chances that I'm actually going to put resources into this case and solve it? If it's very little, why am I going to put my resources here when I've got 5 or 6 over here that I can solve? That just makes sense, right? So I that's where the world is. I mean, and Alvin and Henry and guys like that, they know that. Criminals know that. They're not stupid. In that aspect, they're not stupid. They know there's only so much effort and energy that a department's going to put into any case. And after it goes by for a certain amount of years, especially a sociopath, they go, yeah, well, that one's dead and gone, pun intended. So that's how they think. That's what their mind says.
I think it's a lot harder to get away with murder now because when you're talking about the 70s, there wasn't debit cards. Most people didn't have a credit card. They paid cash for the gas. There were no surveillance cameras. There wasn't DNA, and you could just drive around. I mean, it's like Alvin going to Ohio and Pennsylvania. In 1989, he went to Biloxi and Shreveport and a place called McLean, Mississippi, and Texarkana, Arkansas, and then came back to Fort Smith and went to Tulsa. There would probably be no record of that had he not written that down on a calendar. There would probably be no record of any of that trip. There's probably no record of the trip to Pennsylvania.
And I know that in his manifesto, really what he talks about as far as crimes in his manifesto is his earlier crimes. I don't want to call them petty crimes, but they're not murder. but then in that manifesto, he just kind of stops. Like there's almost like he was, born again Christian, and I'm a member of the Church of Christ, and I changed my ways. But he will only go as far and admit as much. But then he has the calendar, like you mentioned, and you know writes down all these dates and these specific places that he went to. And in my mind, there has to be there's importance to that. Like there was a reason that he wants to document these travels.
There's two things that bother me. And one is there is a lot in that manifesto, but did he write that manifesto as a recollection of what he remembers, or did he write it hoping that someone would make a movie or do a show about him? So I'm kind of, I just don't know which it is.
Yeah, well, where we left off, he mentions, the prison guard that allegedly saw his powers and abilities. And I want to write a book about that. And he mentions that. So now I'm starting to, yeah, I'm going to start writing this. And so I think mid manifesto, he kind of gives us his reason for writing that manifesto. But it also made claims. If you read it, you're going to get all these answers. Answers to what?
Yeah, but who did he claim
So
that to? He claimed that to law enforcement, right? He continually taunted law enforcement with that. He continually said, "Hey, if y'all read my manifesto, you'll know what I've done. You'll know all the answers to all the secrets to all the kingdom of the world." And that was a taunt. And
he said, if you're smart enough to read it and you're smart enough, you will figure it out. That's what he said. He said that to a deputy in Crawford County, Arkansas, when they were looking for a kidnapping victim. But no one ever read it that I know of.
they didn't
People
know
have
what
seen
it
it,
was.
but nobody ever read it. Mm-mm. No, but I want to challenge all of the listeners to go to our website at remembereveryvictim.com, because that whole manifesto is going to be on our website and they will be able to read it for themselves.
It'll take the breath out of you.
So I want to.
Everybody I've
Yeah.
ever let read it.
And
Get your
and
favorite
the thing
snack. Get your
is
favorite
that,
drink.
yeah,
Sit down and read it.
the thing is, like Jeremy had said earlier, is that so much of it we know actually happened. And the only things that we don't know for sure are things that we have not yet proven. But everything that we know that he actually was involved in is in that manifesto. He talks about, shooting two people when he was a child. And I say a child, he was a child. I interviewed a woman that was a lot older than him. She remembered him coming to her house and she always fed him. And then ended up being his mother-in-law with the mother of his first wife, and she, validated a lot of that. And so there's nothing that I found in there that I can prove is not true, and that bothers me too. And I think that's kind of what Jeremy was saying, that we know a lot of these things happen, but some of the things that happened, we don't know that it's true or not true. But I do challenge everybody to go to our website and look at it.
Well, and I think Jeremy had said something that's a little interesting. Jeremy, you had mentioned that he would kind of insert himself into investigations, and I think specifically investigations that were murder victims. How would he insert himself into those investigations?
Well, multiple ways. I mean, okay, so he was not taken seriously. Well, okay, let's just be real. I'm going to get a little blunt here for a minute. The man had an odor that everybody talks about in his later life, and he probably was always some impaired on something and an irritant, the kind that if law enforcement comes in contact, it's like, God, I don't want to deal with you today. That's the theory. That it's like, go away. He probably knew that, and he probably got that reaction a lot. And he probably went up there playing games and going, "Hey, did y'all know who might have kidnapped this girl? Um, I heard, it could be so and so." It's like the house fire, the same thing. He comes to the house fire. Hey, did my neighbor die in that fire? Because if he did, well, guess what? He signed a quick claim deed, and I own that house now. And I think there's a body maybe buried over here in the yard. I mean, that's the kind of stuff he would do. He would just be, and nobody took him seriously. They looked at him as a town drunk / idiot / not a real criminal. Like they didn't look at him as, oh, this is a legit bad guy. They looked at him as, get away from me. Just a vagrant, and so all the things he would say to law enforcement, and this is not uncommon. This is not uncommon. It takes a lot of experience for a law enforcement officer to take someone seriously. Sometimes you have years of experience before you can look at someone and go, "Oh, they're not lying to me." Because in law enforcement, 85% of the people we talk to are just telling their side of the story. I'm not going to say they're not lying, but what they're not doing is telling both sides of the story. They're telling their side. And there's this side, and there's this side, and the truth's always somewhere in the middle. So we always take everything everybody says with a grain of salt until we can prove it. Well, a lot of the stuff he was probably saying was so outlandish, and he was so crude that we didn't, in law enforcement, no one took the time to believe him, right? No one said, "Oh yeah, this guy's legit. He's a problem." There may have been a few. I believe there was a few that looked at him as a real problem, but nobody ever got far enough to prove it. I mean, he was a suspect. Patty, was he not?
So he was, but something else that he did, and there was an investigator in Oklahoma that said he was ready to charge him, but the prosecutor said he came forward with these premonitions, and you cannot prove or disprove a premonition is real. And what he said is, I think she was being chased down a dirt road by two guys in a white vehicle, and her clothes are folded up neatly beside her in the grave. And when she was found, that was the case. But because they couldn't prove or disprove a premonition, the prosecuting attorney or district attorney at that time chose not to try to try him. And he would do that. He would call and say, I had this premonition or I had a dream, and they wouldn't touch that. I mean, they kind of had to wonder, I'm sure. But if you go to a prosecutor because somebody had a dream or a premonition,
Yeah,
there's not a lot there. I mean,
I worked a case with a psychic. This case was from the 80s, and this psychic allegedly knew exactly where the body was when it was dumped, exactly the 5 counties that the suspect took her and tortured her in a car ride, and then dumped her, choked her to death, and all that. And this psychic became pretty wealthy off this case. And I worked this case for years. And during those years, I started to believe the psychic had to have something to do with it. There's no way this psychic knew where this body was dumped, because I just don't believe in psychics, right? Well, it took me quite a bit of time to be able to finally find the connections and find out, oh, the psychic was getting information from the detective because it was an inappropriate relationship. The psychic was then able to, and the detective were able to capitalize on that by saying, yeah, she knew exactly where the body was going to be and all this, because they were working together in cahoots to make it seem like there was a psychic powers. The reality of the situation, though, is you can't put that in a news article. You can't put that. It is in law enforcement. That doesn't help your case, right? What your job in law enforcement to do is to solve the crime, not to care about the BS. You got to wade through the BS and get to who committed this crime, why they commit it, and how can I prove it, and when do we go to court on it. That's what you're focused on. But for years, I had to prove how this psychic would know. And you probably had a whole lot of phone calls on each one of these cases that Patty's talking about, where someone would call up there and, I have information, and you get a tip line out there, you're going to get all kinds of information. You have to figure out what that information is valid, and sometimes that's really hard to do, and sometimes you'll never do it. Even if you have the information in front of you, you can't ever prove it. It's not uncommon. You know, like it or not, crimes go unsolved. But that's what we're doing. That's what we're trying to fix, is we're trying to make it harder and give more resources and capabilities to law enforcement to make that harder to do. And the people that committed crimes in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s and 2010s, I want them living on edge a little bit. I want them going, uh-oh, there's some folks out that are still after me. They didn't forget about this. And I also want the victims' families and the victims knowing someone is still fighting for them. That's important. That's my whole world right there. Is as long as I know I'm doing something to help a victim, I feel better.
So I want to say this, Jeremy. When we got started, it was because of Alvin Lee Myers. And I know these first 3 podcasts have been about Alvin Lee Myers, but we are going to dig into some homicides, local homicides, to Arkansas and Oklahoma. We're going to dive deep into those. We have the case files and we work those cases, and we probably know as much about them as anybody. You can go to law enforcement, and he's right. A lot of times it's musical chairs. A lot of times the detective that was over it has retired or aged out or passed away. And they have so much crime that is current, they don't always have time to work the cold cases. A lot of time it's frustration. The cold case has gone nowhere and they don't think they have any new leads or any new avenues, so they just get exasperated with it. And it's like with Alvin. Several agencies in different states knew about Alvin, but none of the new law enforcement that was on site at that time knew about Alvin. They did not know his history. It was before digital records. It was before, he was older then, and most of his crimes had been when he was younger. And you think about an officer that worked a 77 case or a 79 case or an 82 case, most of them are gone. And so in defense of the police department, I want to say that the night that he did all this, they're just looking at him as a crazy old man that lives next door. I mean, that's all they saw because they didn't know his history. Now, once some of the people that did know his history heard that we had access to his house, they were more than willing to come over and do GPR, a ground penetrating sonar, do an excavation. They were, but it wasn't the local new investigators because they did not know who Alvin Lee Myers was. And I think that happens a lot. And back then, there was very little communication, specifically between states, much less county to county. And we still see that today, but not to the extent that you saw it in the 70s and 80s.
Jess, we're not done with Alvin, but Patty's right. I mean, we've gone over a lot of his stuff. We're going to post his manifesto, and I think at this point we allow the audience to tell us what they want to hear about, and then we go into the research that we have on each individual crime, whether it exists or not. And I think that's really going to guide us where we go with Alvin, because there is so many cases that we have that are we have so much information on, and we want to get out there, and we want to get information out there because I think that there's people out there that can help us, and I want those suspects knowing we're still looking. We're still looking.
Well, and see, that's another reason I want people to look at the manifesto. Somebody in Hackett, Arkansas, or Benton, Arkansas, or wherever, they might look at that manifesto and something might just become clear to them that we've all overlooked. They might know in McLean, Mississippi. I remember that guy.
And that's the beautiful thing. That's the beautiful thing about us getting as many eyes as possible on the manifesto or any other evidence that we can share. um, because it's always great to have fresh eyes. And
Mhm. Mhm.
and like I said, at this point, we've pretty much covered the manifesto. We're going to put it out on the website, remembereveryvictim.com, for anyone to go and look at, go read. And
I encourage people to read it.
yes, yes. In these next episodes, while he does talk about crimes that he committed, it's also crimes that we already knew that he committed, some that he even went to prison for. But there is a lot that he is connected to and suspected of doing, and we will come back and revisit that in our next episodes. But once again, do not forget to like and subscribe on YouTube. Don't forget to like and listen to us on iTunes, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcasts. And do not forget to go and visit our website at remembereveryvictim.com. And we will see you next time.
Revamp is committed to forging a robust network of clear communication and understanding among the victim, the victim's family, law enforcement, and all parties involved in an unresolved case. Our mission is to provide a thorough service that uncovers resources, delivers vital information to support all parties, and rekindles public interest in these cases.